And I am Eric. Here I'm going to post a link to the meeting notes in case you want to check them out. And this is going to be recorded and all that, so be nice. And we'll post it on the web for all of your friends to watch. So first on the agenda, we have Miranda talking about the groups, the system design for the rerun button authorization. Would you like to start?
So for those of you who haven't met me, I guess I'm Miranda. I'm an intern, and I'm working on redesigning the rerun button on the Prow status page. Let me link my design doc. And so basically today I wanted to get feedback on the approval system we're going to be using to determine who can rerun which tests. Let me see how to share my screen without making an infinite loop. So just to give an overview of my project, basically the button that I'm working on is this one that's pointed to. And right now, if you click on it, it shows you a pop-up that has a command that you paste into the terminal that'll rerun the test for you. And so only people with cluster access can do that. And so basically the goal here is to come up with a safe way to trigger direct reruns, and also an efficient way to specify who can trigger these reruns. And so what we have now is we have an option to allow anyone to rerun any tests. That's the allow anyone flag. We also have a global whitelist of users who can rerun any job. We have a way of checking just the same as with pre-submits test foo. And we have the same thing as before. Anyone with cluster access can rerun any job. But what we don't have is a way to specify groups of people who can rerun a given job. So we want to do this efficiently. And so basically the question is whether to use GitHub teams or to make our own sort of groups configuration. The pros of GitHub teams are that they're already made for us. It's less work. There's a nice UX, but it creates more dependence on GitHub. With our own groups, we'd have more freedom, but it would also be more work. So I was just wondering, like before I implement this, if anyone has any preference.
So very broadly speaking, I would prefer to not have another system on top. So I would really prefer the GitHub one. Also, I mean, the whole thing uses the GitHub OAuth right now, right? You cannot use another authentication system, so it's bound to GitHub anyways at this point.
I think that we're trying not to create a tight coupling there. I know that we'd like to have an option to use different authentication systems, though. And if we tightly couple to GitHub, then it depends. We can't. I guess the alternative is either creating something that's tightly coupled to GitHub, or create something that is just accepts any usernames, and then we can have it in our own bespoke system. Kind of like what we do for owners files.
The previous usage of GitHub also was not any form of actual authentication. It was just avoiding using a single token to list everything and using the user's token instead. Just not quite the same thing. It was scoped to the PR dashboard, which is inherently GitHub.
Would that be something that could be solved by using like a tool like Dex? Then you could link your GitHub into it and still use Teams for that. Well, not depending on GitHub directly.
Yeah, so I think an option would be to still use the GitHub authentication to figure out who you are, but then have our own way of then listing like which users are in which groups and which groups can rerun which jobs. So I think either way, there's a dependence on GitHub to figure out who the user is. Just the question is more whether we want to depend on GitHub for groups as well.
I sort of feel like there's a little bit of precedence for using GitHub Teams as a authorization strategy, like the sticky LGTM feature. I think, if I recall correctly, uses a GitHub team. And I mean, in general, to the extent that we have authorization, it all seems to depend on GitHub. And right, like we use that to determine whether or not you can LGTM or if you can assign or whatever. So I feel like that, and then we have tools for managing, right, like Parabolus to manage what teams exist. So I feel like that should definitely be an option. And it seems like a good maybe group people, like the people working, like Will and others working on Scallywag might be a good set of people to talk to, right? They're sort of working on the, GitHub abstraction layer. And so I might sort of think about making it part of that work and sort of do, maybe not worrying about it for your thing specifically.
I think there's a little bit of another question too, which is how we're going to actually be associating these. Or are we imagining that we list the teams that can run each job in the job config with the individual jobs?
Yeah, that's what I was imagining.
Okay. I think that makes sense. The main use case for this right now is for jobs that we don't have other triggering mechanisms like the like pre-submits already can use the reuse the test foo logic to determine if the user is trusted. So I guess this is just for other ones.
Yeah, for the pre-submits, we already have most of the logic that we'll want. Because right now, like if someone were to comment test something on a PR, then we already have the systems for checking whether they're allowed to do that. So this is more for, I guess, like periodics and post-submits.
I'm imagining for the post-submit case, it could be kind of nice to allow teams for an entire repo instead of requiring them on the individual jobs.
For post submits, I think two options that immediately jump out at me are people that already control whether something merges, and those would be people that have write access to the repo, or those that are in owners files at the top level.
The thing about the owners files is that in order to check out the repo,
I think your microphone is not working for some reason. Now I think it is. Oh no, maybe it's not. Someone else is. Maybe I'm hearing somebody else.
Not sure how to fix that.
Now it's working.
It's working? Okay. The thing about the owners files is I think to read them, you have to check out the repo, which is slow. But I'm not sure how slow or whether it's too slow or whether we care about that.
Right, and like our Git implementation right now has a cache that we can use to do it as well.
At the point of the rerun, we already have that file checked out anyways.
In a different component though.
I think the performance is not too much of an issue, as Steve mentioned, but I don't really think the owner's file should be an indicator if you may run post submits.
That's kind of my stance as well. I'm not sure that that's actually, like, they are kind of related in terms of level of trust, but I don't know that that's actually the indicator that we should be using.
So I guess one of the things is for us, we generally have for every repo, there's a post submit that like publishes images. And one of the things that people always want to be able to do is manually trigger another publish when something fails. I don't want to restrict that. Like I want to find a design that doesn't have us listing groups of people everywhere. That also doesn't require that people have write access to all these repos. And top level owners seems like a...
Wait, so you want to require that people have write access?
Well, I think having write access or having admin access should let you push the button on a post submit, since you can effectively push to the branch whatever you want.
I mean, I think one of the goals that we've stated with Prow at least is to try and get people away from having to have write access, right?
Yeah, so that's what I'm saying, is like having top-level owners as a separate mechanism or the only mechanism to trigger, to have the trust to trigger these post submits would be a good thing.
Why do we switch to top-level owners, though, instead of using repo right? Like, I don't know that either of those make sense, right? Why would top-level owners make sense, I guess?
Because they can approve a PR, like they can make something merge whenever they want. They already have that right. And by merging, you trigger a post submit.
So how about, like, we have the definition of the job and we have a set of people who are able to control the definition of the job. It seems like we could use that set of users as people who can rerun the job, right? Because essentially if I have approval rights to make an arbitrary change to the job definition, I can basically do whatever it wants anyway. And so therefore it seems like that might be a good set of people to be able to rerun the job.
I mean, that the use of owners files with prow config is not generally true everywhere, I don't think.
And that's currently not plumbed through either, right?
But we could, I mean, it certainly seems like we could make that the case. I mean, the two things, right? I mean, basically where the job is defined, it seems like they're either someone is going to have write access to the Git repo, or they are going to have, they're going to be in an owner's file, I would assume. I mean, I guess technically they could write a tied config that doesn't use owners or something.
I guess I'm thinking even if we did assume that the like root owners are people that should be able to run these jobs, that's not sufficient probably. Like we want other people to be able to rerun some types of post-submit jobs, so we're going to need some other level of specification to say that these teams or these individuals can run the jobs.
That
makes
fine,
sense.
as long as that's not the only way.
Well, I'm kind of thinking if we have to have that way, why would we implement another parallel mechanism anyways?
Because I don't want to have to maintain a list of people for 300 repos.
Well, that's why we're using GitHub teams, right?
I guess that assumes that I've already set up GitHub teams.
Yeah, I guess we're
Like,
using the
owners already exist, right?
mechanism.
I like the part of the owners that you automatically get an audit trail for who gets added when, and even if you add a comment, why.
The same argument can be made if you use Privy Borders to manage GitHub teams.
Do I have an audit trail for GitHub teams when someone was added?
If you're using the automation that we have to manage them, then yes.
So Parables is our tool for declaring what teams we want to exist, and you can get PRs to add and remove people, and then Parabolus will add and remove those people.
It's really easy to figure out that that tool does that because it's got a really simple name.
Right.
Okay, so I guess one other thing that we should think about then if we are trying to support owners files is the repo checkout. Are we okay with all of our front-end replicas checking out all repos known to man to do all this stuff?
I mean, we need to do it on demand, and we could do a shallow clone, right?
Can't you just fetch the owners file through GitHub's APIs?
Oh, I guess in this case, we only care about the root owners file too. So that's a good point, Ben.
Right.
I don't think it should be the root owners file. I feel like it should be all of the owners for the, I feel like it should just follow the, like if we're going to go with owners, I feel like if I define a job, where I've defined the job, there's a whole nesting of owners files, and we should allow anyone who has approval rights to that job to be able to rerun it.
I think we're saying to the repo, not the job.
Yeah.
I don't think that's the right, I don't think that makes sense because not all jobs are associated with a repo.
Not all jobs are associated with an owners file.
I think that's fine to, I'd be okay with saying that in order to rerun jobs, you need to have owners files associated with your jobs.
I think the complexity there is then we have to somehow like telegraph the structure of the config and what directory holds which files. Like we don't have that. There's no concept of like who owns the pre-submits for this repo today.
Well, we could put that into the in repo config design. I feel like that'll essentially have to be part of that.
If you do go do this, you should look at Tempelis a bit, which has some concepts around like people owning pieces of the config and that actually being enforced.
Yeah, like I mean, I guess Eric, like we don't even have we don't even have a way to enforce that, like not a generic way to enforce that a specific directory is the only directory that contains pre-submits or post-submits for a specific repo, right? Like I feel like to support what you're saying, there's a lot of background work to get done.
I think a lot of it would be nice to enforce, but like Steve is saying, we don't really have any precedents for that right now, so that'd be kind of a big step.
I guess to me, it sort of feels like a good first step would be to just have a raw list of teams or whatever, just have a list. And then we, to sort of have the functionality, right? Eventually somewhere something is going to call a function and it gets a list of users that are allowed to rerun this job. And then we will validate that the authenticated user is in that list. And so we can, over time, make the implementation of how we get that list of users more complicated and correct. I sort of feel like a good process would be to just go with the simplest thing, which might be to declare a list of users, I would say, for the whole proud deployment, as opposed to allowing each job to specify different people who can rerun. That seems kind of more complicated than necessary.
Yeah, that was already included in the whitelist. That's already done.
Yeah, and so I would potentially just start with that, and then we design the thing that we actually want, and then we start implementing that.
I think that's what this conversation is about, though.
What's the next step?
Well, I know, but essentially, I feel like we are saying that this might be. It sounds like we are saying, oh, that is too complicated or something, or whatever. My suggestion is being rejected as being too complicated, but I feel like if we already have the basic use case in, I feel like we should be thinking about the eventual state we want to get to, rather than what is the most efficient thing to hack in.
Yeah, I guess my comment about complexity there was less about like efficiency and speed, but more like we currently make absolutely no statement about checking your config into Git in the first place, or how you do that, or how you federate owners inside of that. Like that's an entirely new set of concepts that doesn't exist today.
We also don't have in repo config today. Something we're working on, but like we can't rely on that until we have that.
So how about if we extend the proud job itself, or the? I mean, to me, potentially, if we had the proud job config as the CRD, we could, have a field that says what teams and/or individuals are allowed to rerun it, and so then we could just check that whenever someone attempts to rerun a job. Or
that
when
we.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, I think that is needed anyways because of periodics. They may not be associated to any repository at all, so no owners file, no nothing.
Yeah, that's kind of the point that I was trying to make earlier. Like, even if we want all this other fancy owners file stuff to handle these use cases better, we're still going to need something for all the other cases, so, for like the periodic case. So I feel like we should be focusing more on getting a solution that will work for everything, and then get the more optimized solutions later.
So are you proposing like a job level whitelist of GitHub teams, and then also potentially like a inheritance-based org repo hierarchy of GitHub teams as well?
I actually like Eric's suggestion to say you put a team on the job, and how we resolve the team to actual users can then be implemented in various ways depending on whatever you use, be it GitHub or something else.
Yes, so essentially, so essentially when we create the job, we specify the list of teams and/or individuals that can rerun the job, and so then Miranda's thing can just check that when someone tries to rerun that job.
That'd be great, especially if we can also provide some hint as to what the actual value is, whether it's a GitHub team, a username, or like an owner's alias or whatever. So if it's like maybe a key value pair there or something like that.
Okay, so just to clarify.
I think your microphone needs to be closer again.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Just to clarify, we're talking about adding a list of people or teams to the job config and then checking that list or like that team to see if a user can rerun that job?
I think we're saying to the job config, but also to the job itself.
Okay, and those are different things.
Yes, so the job config is kind of just a config map YAML file, whereas the proud job itself is a custom resource that's uploaded into the Kubernetes API. And so that thing right now, it's going to have like a pod spec or a build spec or a pipeline spec. We'd add a field to say like rerun list, or maybe rerun teams and rerun users or whatever. We'd have some fields there in addition to the other ones that specify who can rerun it. And so every time we create a job, we will, then maybe there can be some amount of, people experimenting with different ways to populate that. But basically, every time we create a job using make PJ or trigger or whatever, it will populate that field when it creates the proud job.
Okay, and regardless of the actual team implementation, we'll need something like that.
Why do we want it to be locked in at resolution time? Because I feel like if we do that, oh, I triggered a job, I want Johnny to also do that. I forgot to add Johnny to the team. I added Johnny to the team. Johnny can forever not have access to re-trigger that job because it's been resolved in the past.
I agree that's suboptimal, but right now we cannot look up a job based on its job name because we don't have unique job names. You're right. It would totally be better if we could look up and config what the correct like real-time value is, but we just can't do that today.
What's our blocker for that?
There's the issue's open. I haven't looked at it in a little while, but yeah, we've got an open issue tracking that.
Maybe we can see if we can knock that one.
I think as a separate, I don't think this should be part of this thing, but I think it would be, and I think we are more or less out of time, but I think it'd be useful to think about moving our jobs into like defining a CRD for our job config as opposed to just having it be in a config map. I don't know if that is that on our list of roadmaps?
Alvaro is trying to achieve a similar goal with a very different approach. We're not trying to use CRDs for job config for any of that.
Yeah, and I think that's a complete different discussion from this we should like not have when we discuss how we want to permit users.
But I think if we had that, then we could sort of say what, if there's like the template config that we spawn the job from, then we can have the list of authorized rerun users attached to that. And then that would enable, because I agree, Steve, that it is awkward to do that since it might be out of date and it's wasteful.
Isn't Alva's work orthogonal to how we store the config once it's created, Cole?
Not completely, I don't think, because we're not trying to store, like with the design we've been discussing, we're not trying to actually store the proud.yaml files anywhere. We're trying to just like always dynamically load them from the repo at the time of use.
Yeah.
That's part of the design so that we get the most up-to-date config with different PRs and everything. If we store the config, then we'd have to have variants for every possible PR.
Yeah. So I guess we should think about how that works with the version config like I was saying. That's a good point.
Okay, well, I need to run. We're 2 minutes over. Should we call it a? Did we have a good discussion? Did you get some of the feedback you wanted? All the feedback you wanted? Shall we close this meeting and do we need to add some more time for next time, or continue talking online, or what do you want?
I feel pretty good about this. If anyone has more comments, feel free to leave them on my design doc. Or yeah, if you have any questions, feel free to ask me as well. Yeah, thanks everyone for your input.
Great, thanks everybody for attending. See you online, and next week this will appear online shortly, this video. Bye.